Alex, welcome to the Leanpub launch video for Lift the Elephant, Scaling Postgres Beyond Query Optimization. I was wondering if you could take a moment just to talk to us a little bit about who you are and about what your book is about and who it's for.
Helen, sure. Thank you. Thanks for having me. So I'm Alex Yarotsky. I'm a CTO at HubStuff, time tracking and employee productivity company. I've been with the company for quite a while. I've been in the tech industry for over 15 years now. I've seen it, done it. And this book is pretty much about what I've learned through mistakes and late night incident mitigation while scaling Postgres.
Yeah, it's so interesting. So for anyone watching who isn't sort of maybe familiar with the kind of technology world, there's the kind of people who write the features that you use when you're interacting with your phone or with your computer and stuff like that. And then there's the people who make all the magic in the background happen. Like, how does information get from your computer to somewhere else and get from somewhere else back to your computer, and what the magic that's going on wherever that somewhere else is in managing all that information. And that's the kind of work that Alex does. And my understanding is you've gone from sort of starting out at a very small kind of scale to a much bigger scale in your career, and you've had to sort of be there every step, learning and figuring things out along the way.
Yeah, that's true. And it's especially the case with HubStuff because as any business, it starts with the idea in mind that, hey, we need to attract more customers. We need to scale operations. That's the first thing in mind of every founder. And nobody ever thinking for a good reason about how should we how should we build our tech so that 10 years from now we can handle the millions of users, right? Maybe we won't be around 10 years from now, so why do we care about that, right? And that's totally natural. And HubStuff went through the same trajectory. Uh, the company is very successful. We are able to uh, grow pretty rapidly, and along this path, there were certain periods where our infrastructure, including our database, would just stop scaling because all the patterns, all the ideas we put into building it in the early days, well, they just don't scale anymore. And yeah, you can go out there and find plenty of great books on the internet on how to improve your database queries, how to do all these important optimizations like adding indexes or maybe optimizing certain things about your database tables, right? But at some moment, your application handles so much data, and it's a great problem to have for any business to handle so much data that you encounter these problems. But at some point, at some point, you find yourself in this situation, and quite often there is no information how to handle these particular cases. Because like literally, I think less than a year and a half ago, I remember the situation like our team in the middle of the night just stares at our screens. Like something weird is going on in the database, and we're like, what the hell is going on? What do we even do about this? And like a myriad of situations like this contributed to the idea of writing this book about how to scale the database beyond just query optimization. Because query optimization and everything developers know about databases is just the tip of the iceberg. When you grow really big, there are other 9/10 of the iceberg that is below the water, below the surface, and that's where the real trouble begins. And that's where you need some help.
Yeah, and I'm really curious to sort of maybe drill down into an example, and I'm just going to make this one up and throw it at you, and you can tell me if it's a bad example and maybe try another one. But to give people an example of what the actual challenge is when you're sort of managing the database on the other end. So, for example, let's say I've a company that sort of provides time tracking, a time tracking app to somebody.
Yeah.
And I start out and I've got 1,000 people clicking a button on there let's say in the browser on their laptop or in an app. And I've got 1,000 people clicking it a day, and then they stop it, and then they start it, and they stop it. And then what happens when I've got 10 million people doing that in a day? What's the difference in how you manage that data?
So in this particular example, you will face multiple problems. Well, problem number one, over time, you accumulate massive amounts of data in this single table that stores information about time records, right? And not only you store the historical data, let's say your company decide that you're going to keep 3 years of historical data, right? But now every day, more and more users create daily records, right? And now your database has to handle these queries differently. If before, when you had just 1,000 users, a query like, well, give me all the time tracking data for the past week for my team is easy because that's data represent pretty much big percentage of small data set. Now, when the data set is such huge that it doesn't even fit into the memory of the physical node where your database is, now your Postgres instance, your database instance, it has to handle this query very differently. And usually with the default settings, it's not prepared to handle it. And now, well, these queries just time out and your users don't see anything. Or if before they could get this query in 10 milliseconds, now they have to wait seconds or minutes to get the same query. And this is where this like beyond query optimization parts come in, because in this particular case where we store so much like time-based data, we can do database partitioning, which is basically, well, let's take this huge table that stores billions of records and break it into weekly chunks, for example. And now we have 100 of tables, but every table contains a very small chunk of your data, and now it's way easier for your database to handle this. And this is one of the dozens of examples that you encounter when you deal with such big amounts of data.
Yeah, that's a really great example because so clearly I like how, you use the sort of wait time and sort of is used to manage data. That's a very clear example. The last thing I want to ask you about is, you mentioned it before, but if you're working at a startup, let's say you're the CTO of a startup that's got 5 people, preparing now for a potential future is a decision that the whole team is going to have to make. And because it means taking time away and maybe even spending money on taking time away from other things you could be doing, maybe spending money on things that you might never need. How do you, if someone's like interesting, they're in that position now, like let's say they're convinced that you need to sort of like, we're going to grow, we're running into these problems. I need to convince my CEO to give me time and money and maybe even developer time or something like that to do this. How would you go about convincing them that it's the right time?
Sure. Well, first of all, like part of like any CTO or technical leader is to be ahead of where your company now. So you should be thinking 6, 12 months ahead, depending on your company time horizon. The smaller the company is, the faster it moves, the more rapid changes are. You don't have to think 12 months ahead. 3 to 6 months is good enough horizon, right? If the company is bigger and the pace of changes is slower, 12 and more months is a good time period. But anyway, monitoring is an important part of pretty much any big system. And I even talk about it in my book that monitoring is important. And there are some key events that you need to keep an eye on with your database. So you need to install these monitoring tools, keep an eye on them. And there will always be signs clearly telling you that, hey, well, you could have a problem here or you could have a problem there, right? And it will give you enough data to go and convince your co-founders, your business partners that it is a good time to start investing into this future because the trends are telling us we're heading there and we have this number of months, weeks, years before system starts crashing. And this is good enough data for any business founder. Nobody wants to see disappointed users leaving because of the downtime or anything.
Exactly. Yeah, that's again very well explained. Actually, the actual last question I have for you. You have a great cover and a great title for your book, "Lift the Elephant." And I just wanted to ask you, where did you come up with that image or that metaphor of lifting an elephant?
So first of all, elephant is a logo of PostgreSQL itself. So that's number one. But secondly, like elephant is something huge, and it's a good metaphor to something big that you don't know how to approach. And I think it's a good metaphor that our team correlates to, because when we were dealing with all these issues with the database while we were scaling, quite often this problem seemed like a huge elephant. From which direction do you approach it to move it forward? And that's where the metaphor is coming from. It's a play of words, well, logo of Postgres and something big, and you don't know how to deal with it. But if you approach it appropriately and use the appropriate tool, then moving even something as huge as an elephant becomes just a task, just a to-do list that you go step by step and move it.
Well, it's a really great book, Alex. Thank you very much for taking the time to do this video with me and for all of our viewers today. The book is Lift the Elephant, Scaling Postgres Beyond Query Optimization. I highly recommend it to anyone in the field.
Thank you.